The first time I heard my son's name spoken in the past tense, it felt like the air left my body before I could decide whether to breathe or scream. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind that pretends to be ordinary. The kettle was screaming on the stove, sharp and impatient. I remember thinking I'd let it boil too long again. My hands were shaking, but I told myself it was just the cold. When the phone rang, I almost ignored it. Nothing good ever comes from a phone call that early, not when your heart is already tired. The voice on the other end was careful, too careful. That's how I knew something was wrong before the words even landed. "Mrs. Harris," the woman said, "I'm calling about your son." I don't remember sitting down, but somehow I was in the chair by the window, staring at the lace curtain I'd never bothered to replace. She kept talking. Her voice kept going. I caught pieces: accident, hospital. They tried everything. When she finally stopped, there was a long silence, like the world was waiting to see what I'd do next. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I pressed my fingers into my thigh so hard I left bruises, just to feel something solid. My son was gone. By the afternoon, the house was full of noise. Neighbors came by with casseroles wrapped in foil. Someone hugged me too tightly and said, "He's in a better place," and I nodded because it was easier than asking them where that place was and why I wasn't invited. I kept waiting for my daughter-in-law to call, to say something, anything, to cry with me, to tell me what to do next. Instead, I got a message from her sister. It was short, polite, almost businesslike. "The funeral arrangements are private. Please respect the family's wishes." I read it 3 times before it made sense. Private. Family's wishes. I was my son's mother. And somehow, in the space of 1 sentence, I was no longer family. Before all this, my life had been small in a good way, predictable, safe. I worked mornings at the library 3 blocks from my house, where the smell of old paper and lemon cleaner made me feel useful. I liked reshelving books because nobody rushed me. Stories waited patiently. People I'd learned did not. My son Daniel used to tease me about it. He'd say, "Mom, you're the only person I know who prefers books to people," and I'd tell him books don't disappoint you on purpose. He was my only child. His father left when Daniel was 6, a quiet leaving that taught me early how to stretch $1 and swallow disappointment. Daniel grew up fast. He learned how to make scrambled eggs before he learned long division. When he moved out for college, the house echoed for weeks. I slept with the hallway light on, just to pretend someone might still need it. He met his wife Claire in his late 20s. He brought her over one Sunday afternoon without warning. I remember because I was wearing my old sweater with the loose sleeve, the one I only wore at home. She stood in my doorway with perfect posture and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom, this is Claire," Daniel said, proud and nervous all at once. She shook my hand like we were at a job interview. I wanted to like her, I really did. I told myself not everyone shows warmth the same way. She was polite, always polite. She thanked me for meals but never asked for seconds. She complimented my home but never sat comfortably in it. When Daniel laughed, she smiled a second too late. They married quickly, too quickly if I'm being honest. I kept my doubts to myself. A mother's worries are easy to dismiss when love is loud. At the wedding, I cried quietly into my napkin, watching my son promise his life to someone I still felt like I didn't know. After they married, things changed in small ways. Daniel called less. When he did, his voice sounded rushed, like he was checking a box. Claire always seemed to be nearby. I could hear her in the background, clearing her throat, reminding him of something. Dinner plans were cancelled last minute. Holidays became negotiations. Still, I told myself this was normal. Sons grow up, they choose their own families. A good mother steps back. I stepped back so far I barely recognized where I was standing. The first clue that something was truly wrong came 6 months before Daniel died. He showed up at my house unannounced, late in the evening. He looked thinner, tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I used to help him with homework. I poured tea. He wrapped his hands around the mug like he needed it to stay upright. "Mom," he said, not looking at me, "if something ever happens to me." I laughed nervously and told him not to talk like that. Mothers don't let their children practice dying. He finally met my eyes. There was fear there, real fear. "I just want you to know I love you," he said, "no matter what anyone says." "Anyone?" I asked him what he meant. He shook his head and stood up too quickly, chair scraping loud against the floor. "It's nothing," he said. "I'm just tired." He hugged me longer than usual before he left. I watched his car disappear down the street, a tight feeling settling in my chest like a stone. After that, Clara stopped answering my calls altogether. Messages went unread. When I asked Daniel about it, he said she was busy, stressed, going through things. Aren't we all, I thought. The night before his accident, he texted me at midnight. "I'm sorry if I ever made you feel pushed aside. I didn't see it until morning. When I was told I wasn't welcome at the funeral, I thought it had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that could be fixed with a phone call and a calm voice. I called Clara, straight to voicemail. I called again and again. Finally, I drove to their house, the one Daniel bought, the one he was so proud of. The porch light was on, but the curtains were drawn tight. I knocked until my knuckles hurt. Clara opened the door just enough to block the view inside. Her eyes were red, but her face was set. "This isn't a good time," she said. "I need to talk to you," I said, "about the funeral." Her jaw tightened. "We've already handled everything." "I'm his mother," I said quietly. "I should be there." She looked past me down the street, like she was checking for witnesses. "Daniel wouldn't have wanted this to be complicated," she said. "Please don't make it harder." Harder? I wanted to ask her what part of burying your child was supposed to be easy. Instead, I went home. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall until the light changed. I thought about the way Daniel used to fall asleep on my chest when he was a baby, his breath warm and uneven. I thought about the man who stood in my kitchen and told me he loved me like it was a goodbye. Something didn't add up. And for the first time, I stopped trying to be polite about it. I decided I was going to find out why my son's own mother had been erased from his final goodbye. I didn't know yet what that search would cost me, but I knew I couldn't stay silent. Not this time. The day of the funeral arrived without waiting for my permission. I woke before dawn, my body already tense, like it had been bracing all night for a blow that finally landed. The house was quiet in that way it only gets when something is missing. I made coffee out of habit, not thirst. It tasted burnt. I drank it anyway. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and looked at myself longer than usual. My face seemed older than it had a week ago. Grief does that. It pulls time forward without asking. I chose a dark blue dress, the one Daniel once told me made my eyes look softer. I pinned my hair back with steady hands. If I was going to be turned away, I would not look like a woman who'd fallen apart. I drove toward the church even though I knew I wasn't supposed to. The roads were quiet, still damp from overnight rain. Every mile felt like a question. Was I really going to do this? Was I going to show up where I was clearly not wanted? When I reached the parking lot, I didn't pull in. I parked across the street instead, half hidden by a row of trees that had already begun to lose their leaves. I watched people arrive. I recognized some of them. Daniel's co-workers, old friends. A few relatives from Clara's side, dressed carefully, whispering to one another. I waited for the moment when someone would look around and realize I wasn't there. It never came. The church doors closed. The service began without me. I stayed in my car, hands clenched around the steering wheel, listening to the faint sound of hymns drifting through the walls. Each note felt like it was pressing on my chest. I imagined Daniel's casket at the front. I imagined Clara standing beside it, accepting sympathy, nodding politely, deciding who belonged and who didn't. By the time the doors opened again, I was shaking. People came out slowly, eyes red, voices low. I watched them hug each other, watched the world acknowledge my son's life without acknowledging mine. Then I saw her. Clara stepped outside with her sister at her side. She looked composed, too composed. Her black dress was fitted perfectly, her makeup flawless. She held her head high like someone who had rehearsed this moment. And that's when something inside me shifted from grief to resolve. I waited until the crowd thinned, then I got out of my car and crossed the street. Clara saw me before I reached her. Her expression changed just for a second. Fear maybe, or anger, it was gone quickly. "You shouldn't be here," she said under her breath. "I didn't come to make a scene," I said. "I came to say goodbye to my son." Her sister stiffened beside her. "This isn't appropriate." "What's not appropriate?" I said, my voice calm despite the tremor in my hands, "is keeping a mother from her child's funeral." Clara leaned closer. "Daniel didn't want you involved," she said. The words were sharp, he practiced. "Did he tell you that?" I asked. She hesitated, just long enough. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. After the funeral, the silence became louder than the noise had been. The house swallowed me whole. I kept expecting my phone to ring with Daniel's name lighting up the screen. It never did. I spent the next few days moving through my life like a visitor. At the library, I misfiled books. At the grocery store, I forgot what I'd come for. At night, I sat at my kitchen table and replayed every conversation I'd had with my son in the last year, searching for something I'd missed. That was when I remembered the envelope. Daniel had always been old-fashioned about certain things. He liked paper bills, handwritten notes. Once, years ago, he'd asked me to keep some documents in my safe. "Just in case," he'd said, shrugging like it wasn't important. I hadn't thought about it in years. I pulled the safe out from the back of my closet and opened it. Inside were my own papers, neatly stacked, and beneath them, an envelope with Daniel's handwriting on the front. My name. I sat down before opening it, my heart pounding like it was trying to warn me. Inside were copies of bank statements, a life insurance policy, and a letter. The paper was creased, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. "Mom," it began, "if you're reading this, then things didn't go the way I hoped." I had to stop there. I pressed my hand to my mouth, breathing through my nose until the room steadied. He wrote about feeling trapped, about arguments that went in circles, about money disappearing and explanations that never quite made sense. He wrote that he loved his wife, but he wasn't sure she loved him the way he needed to be loved. And then he wrote the sentence that made my hands go cold. "If anything happens to me, please make sure Clara doesn't control everything." I read that line over and over. The policy named me as a secondary beneficiary. Not her. I understood then why I'd been shut out, why the funeral had been private, why she wanted me nowhere near the process. This wasn't just grief. This was control. I didn't confront her right away. I needed to understand the full picture. I made copies of everything and put the originals back where they belonged. Then I called an old friend of Daniel's, Mark. They worked together for years. He sounded relieved to hear from me. "She's been telling people you didn't want to be involved," he said carefully, "that you were distant." I closed my eyes. "That's not true." "I didn't think so," he said. "Daniel talked about you all the time." Mark told me about the weeks before the accident, about Daniel sleeping on his office couch, about arguments overheard through thin walls, about Daniel asking questions about changing beneficiaries and separating finances. Piece by piece the story took shape. Clara hadn't just pushed me out. She'd been building a wall. The confrontation happened on a Sunday afternoon. I showed up at her house again, this time with a purpose. She didn't answer the door at first. I knocked again, harder. When she finally opened it, her face was pale. "I know about the policy," I said without preamble. Her eyes flicked behind me, then back. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Daniel left instructions," I said, "and a letter." Silence filled the space between us. "You had no right," she said finally. "He was my son," I replied. "I had every right." Her composure cracked then. "You don't understand what it was like," she said, her voice rising, "living with someone who was always halfway out the door." I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. "I understand more than you think," I said, "and I understand why you didn't want me at that funeral." She stared at me, her breathing uneven. "I'm not here to take anything from you," I continued, "but I won't be erased, not from his life and not from his death." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she closed the door. The next weeks were heavy with whispers. The policy came up, questions were asked. Clara withdrew from social gatherings. People began to notice the gaps in her story. I stayed quiet. I let the truth surface on its own. Grief has a way of stripping things bare, of showing people who you are when the performance ends. I visited Daniel's grave alone one morning. The grass was still new, too green. I knelt and placed my hand on the stone. "I'm here," I whispered. "I always was." The anger I'd been holding loosened its grip. Not because everything was resolved, but because I'd finally been seen. Not by everyone, but by him. After the confrontation, the days began to blur together in a way that felt both merciful and cruel. Merciful because it dulled the sharpest edges of the pain. Cruel because it reminded me that time does not stop for grief. It moves forward whether you are ready or not. People started calling again, slowly at first, an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years, one of Daniel's old teachers, even a neighbor from his childhood who said she still remembered the sound of his bike rattling down the sidewalk. Each call brought a memory. Each memory brought a fresh ache. What surprised me most was how many people asked the same question, quietly, almost apologetically. Why weren't you at the funeral? I learned to answer it without breaking. It was decided to keep it small, I'd say, or there were complications. I didn't lie exactly, I just didn't tell the whole truth, not yet. The truth has weight. You don't drop it on people without knowing where it will land. Clara stayed silent. She didn't call, didn't text. She moved through town like a shadow, showing up only where she had to. When I did see her, she looked thinner, sharper around the edges. Grief hadn't softened her the way it softened some people. It had tightened her grip. I focused on practical things. I met with a lawyer, a calm woman with kind eyes who spoke in measured tones and never rushed me. She confirmed what I already knew. The documents were clear. Daniel had been deliberate. He trusted you, she said simply. That sentence stayed with me. Trust is a quiet thing. It doesn't announce itself. You only realize how strong it was when you're holding it alone. As the legal pieces moved into place, something else began to shift. People started talking, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for the truth to travel. A friend of mine ran into Clara at the pharmacy. Clara avoided eye contact. Another acquaintance mentioned that Clara had cancelled plans indefinitely. Someone else said she'd been overheard arguing with an insurance representative in a parking lot. None of it brought me satisfaction, only confirmation. I thought about Daniel's last months, how tired he'd looked, how careful he'd been with his words, how that letter had carried more love than fear. I wondered how long he'd felt alone while standing right beside someone. One afternoon, I received a call from Clara's sister. I think we should talk, she said. We met at a small cafe near the river, neutral ground, public enough to keep tempers in check. She arrived first, stirring her coffee so hard it sloshed against the sides of the cup. I didn't know, she said as soon as I sat down, about the letter, about the policy. I watched her hands, they were shaking. She told us you didn't care, she continued, that you were cold, that you made things worse for him. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. That wasn't true. I see that now, she said quietly, and I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't fix everything, but it opens a door. She told me things Clara never had, about the arguments that turned cruel, about control disguised as concern, about money moved without explanation, about a marriage that looked stable from the outside and felt suffocating from within. He didn't know how to leave, she said, and she knew that. I nodded. Some people don't need chains when they know how to use guilt. When we parted ways, she hugged me. It was awkward, brief but sincere. I hope you find some peace, she said. I hoped the same for both of us. The public consequences came quietly, like most real consequences do. Clara lost friends, not all at once. One by one, invitations stopped coming, conversations grew shorter, people stopped defending her when questions arose. At the library, a woman approached me between shelves. She placed her hand gently on my arm. You raised a good man, she said. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an accusation. It was recognition. That mattered more than I expected. I visited Daniel's grave regularly. Sometimes I talked, sometimes I just sat. I brought fresh flowers and brushed leaves away from the stone. I told him about the small things, a new book at the library, a stray cat that had started sleeping on my porch, ordinary life continuing. One morning as I stood to leave, I noticed something at the edge of the plot. A small wooden cross with his name carved into it, not official, not polished. Someone else had been there. I smiled through tears. The hardest part wasn't the anger, it was the letting go. Letting go of the version of my son who might have been saved. letting go of the future I'd imagined, letting go of the need to be understood by everyone. Grief teaches you what matters, not loudly, slowly. I didn't forgive Claire in the way people like to talk about forgiveness. There was no grand gesture, no tearful reconciliation. I forgave her in the sense that I stopped carrying her choices as my burden. That was enough. Months passed, the seasons turned. I found myself laughing again, surprised by the sound. I planted a small garden in my backyard. Daniel had always said I should get my hands dirty more often. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and felt something close to peace settle around me. Not happiness, but peace. I think often about that word family, how easily it's used, how quickly it can be taken away. Family isn't who controls the room when you're gone. It's who keeps your name alive when you can't speak for yourself. I did that for my son. And in doing so, I found my way back to myself. The first real sign that healing had begun came quietly, the way most honest changes do. I was shelving books at the library when I caught myself humming. It took me a moment to realize what I was doing. The tune wasn't anything special, just a melody I used to hum while cooking dinner when Daniel was a boy. I stopped mid-shelf, my fingers resting against the spine of a worn novel, and let the sound fade. I didn't feel guilty for it. That surprised me. For months, any moment of lightness had felt like betrayal, as if smiling meant forgetting, as if laughter erased love, but standing there between the shelves, surrounded by stories that had survived centuries of loss and joy alike, I understood something new. Remembering doesn't require suffering forever. Around that same time, the legal matters reached their end, the policy was settled, everything unfolded exactly as Daniel had intended. No drama, no courtroom scenes, just signatures and quiet confirmations. Claire did not contest it, whether out of exhaustion or realization I never knew. She moved away shortly after, no goodbye, no explanation, just gone. People asked me how I felt about that. I told them the truth. Relieved. Not because I wished her harm, but because her absence felt like the final closing of a door that should never be reopened. I didn't follow her life after that. I didn't ask questions. I learned that peace sometimes means refusing to look back, even when curiosity tugs at you. One afternoon, Daniel's friend Mark stopped by. He stood awkwardly on my porch, holding a paper bag like he didn't know what to do with his hands. I was cleaning out my garage, he said, found some things that belonged to him. Inside the bag were small pieces of a life, a baseball cap, a notebook filled with half-written ideas, a photo of the two of them younger, arms slung around each other, laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. At the bottom was a folded piece of paper. "I think this one's for you," Mark said softly. It was a letter, not sealed, just folded like it had been meant to be handed over someday. "Mom," it began again. This one was different, shorter, lighter. He wrote about childhood memories, about the way I used to sit on the edge of his bed when he was sick, about how safe the house always felt, no matter how small it was. "I didn't realize how rare that was until I was grown," he wrote. I cried then, not the sharp, gasping kind of crying that had ruled the early days. This was quieter, slower, like rain soaking into dry ground. When I finished reading, Mark was still standing there, his eyes wet. "He loved you," he said. "I know," I replied. And for the first time since his death, saying those words didn't feel like something I had to defend. The public reckoning never came in a dramatic wave. There were no announcements, no apologies broadcasted, just a subtle shift in how people spoke, how they looked at me, how they spoke about Daniel. Truth doesn't need a stage, it only needs time. At a community gathering, someone mentioned Claire's name and then stopped mid-sentence, glancing at me uncertainly. "It's all right," I said. "You don't have to protect me from my own life." They nodded, grateful. I didn't correct every false story that lingered. Some things weren't worth revisiting, but when someone asked directly, I answered honestly, calmly, without bitterness. That steadiness surprised people. It surprised me too. I started volunteering at a grief support group hosted at the community center, not as a speaker, just as someone who made coffee, arranged chairs, listened. I didn't share my story unless asked. One evening, a woman about my age sat beside me, her hands twisting a tissue into shreds. "They wouldn't let me see him at the end," she whispered. "They said I didn't belong." I took her hand. "You belong," I said. "Sometimes the lesson you survive becomes the one you're meant to pass on." The seasons turned again. I watched the leaves change color and fall, each one letting go without asking permission. Winter came quietly. Snow dusted the porch where Daniel used to sit when he visited, his boots kicked off, his shoulders relaxed in a way he never quite managed anywhere else. On the anniversary of his death, I went to the cemetery early in the morning. The ground was frozen, the air sharp. I brought fresh flowers and a small framed photo I'd never displayed before. I talked to him then, out loud, about everything I hadn't said. "I wish I'd asked more questions," I told the cold stone. "I wish I'd pushed harder. I wish you'd felt you could come home and stay." The wind moved through the trees, soft but insistent. "But I'm proud of you," I continued, "for loving deeply, for trying, for trusting me." I stayed until my fingers went numb. When I left, I didn't feel like I was abandoning him. I felt like I was carrying him forward. Life didn't return to what it was before, it never does, but it found a new shape. I redecorated the spare room that had slowly turned into a shrine. I donated some of Daniel's clothes, kept others. Balance is important. Holding on and letting go can exist in the same space. I traveled for the first time in years. Nothing extravagant, just a quiet seaside town where the air smelled like salt and the days moved gently. I walked along the shore and thought about how grief is like the tide. It pulls back, then returns, but each time it leaves something different behind. One evening, sitting on a bench overlooking the water, a stranger asked if the seat beside me was taken. "No," I said. We talked about nothing important, the weather, the waves, the way time feels faster as you age. When he left, he wished me well and I believed him. Connection doesn't end with loss. It just asks you to be brave enough to try again. I still think about the funeral sometimes, about the closed doors, the hymns I heard from across the street, the way grief was treated like something that could be managed by exclusion. I no longer feel the need to rewrite that day. What matters is everything that came after. What matters is that my son's story didn't end with silence. It didn't end with control. It ended with truth. And truth has a way of circling back, even when people try to bury it. I learned that dignity isn't loud, justice doesn't always announce itself, and strength often looks like a woman standing quietly in her own life, refusing to be erased. I was banned from my son's funeral, but I was never banned from being his mother. And no one ever could be. There's a quiet kind of strength that comes after everything loud has already broken. I didn't recognize it at first. I thought strength would feel like certainty, like confidence, like standing tall and knowing without question that I had done everything right. Instead, it felt more like steadiness, like learning how to place one foot in front of the other without asking the ground for permission. The town adjusted to my grief the way small towns do. Slowly, awkwardly, people stopped whispering when I walked by. They stopped lowering their voices. My pain became familiar enough that it no longer startled anyone. That was both comforting and lonely. One afternoon, months after everything had settled, I was sorting through a box of Daniel's things I'd been avoiding. Not the important papers or the items people usually think to save. This box held the ordinary pieces, a cracked phone charger, a set of keys that no longer opened anything, old receipts folded into pockets of jackets I hadn't worn in years. At the bottom, I found a voicemail transcript printed on plain white paper. I didn't remember printing it. The date caught my eye. It was from the night before his accident. I sat down on the floor and read it slowly. "Hey Mom," it said, "I know it's late. I just wanted to hear your voice, but I didn't want to wake you. If you get this, call me tomorrow, or don't. Just know I'm thinking about you. Love you." There was nothing dramatic about it. No warnings, no confessions. Just love. I folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the box. Then I closed the lid and didn't open it again. Some things don't need to be revisited once they've been honored. The support group at the community center grew over time. More people came, different ages, different stories. Loss has a way of leveling people. It doesn't care who you were before it arrived. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I chose my words carefully. I don't believe healing means forgetting, I told them once. I think it means learning how to carry love without letting pain lead the way. A man across the circle nodded, tears slipping down his face. A woman squeezed my hand. After the meeting, she lingered behind. They kept me away from my sister, she said quietly. When she was sick, I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't tell her my story, I didn't need to. I'm sorry, I said, that kind of loss stays with you. But you seem all right, she said. How did you do that? I thought about that for a long moment. I stopped asking for permission to grieve, I said finally, and I stopped letting other people decide what my love was worth. She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Every now and then, someone would ask if I'd ever spoken to Claire again. I hadn't. But one morning, nearly a year after Daniel's death, a letter arrived with no return address. I recognized the handwriting immediately. I didn't open it right away. I placed it on the table and made myself breakfast. I fed the stray cat on the porch. I watered the plants. I lived my life for a little while before allowing the past to step back in. When I finally opened the envelope, the paper inside was thin. The words pressed hard, as if written with too much force. She wrote that she was sorry, not in a neat, tidy way, not with clarity. It was messy, defensive in places, regretful in others. She wrote about fear, about losing control, about not knowing how to share grief without feeling like it would swallow her whole. She admitted she'd been wrong to shut me out. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for anything at all. When I finished reading, I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't write back. Not because I hadn't forgiven her, but because forgiveness doesn't always require a response. Sometimes it's enough to set something down and walk away lighter. On Daniel's birthday, I baked his favorite cake, chocolate with too much frosting. I laughed at myself while spreading it unevenly, remembering how he used to scrape extra frosting off the bowl with his finger. I lit a single candle and let it burn for a while before blowing it out. To another year, I said softly. I shared the cake with neighbors, with friends, with the support group. I told stories, not sad ones, funny ones, stories where Daniel was alive and laughing and whole. That night, as I washed dishes in the quiet kitchen, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Gratitude. Not for the loss, never for the loss, but for the love that had come before it. I learned that grief doesn't end, it changes shape. It learns your routines, it becomes less demanding, it sits beside you instead of in front of you. There are still moments when the absence feels sharp, when I see a man Daniel's age walking down the street and have to look away, when I hear a song he loved and my chest tightens before I can stop it. But those moments pass, and what remains is something quieter, something sturdier. Love that doesn't need permission. Memory that doesn't need approval. A bond that can't be cut by closed doors or whispered decisions. I was banned from my son's funeral, but I stood at his grave when the world was quiet. I speak his name without hesitation. I carry him with me into every ordinary day. And in doing so, I honor him far more deeply than any ceremony ever could. Sometimes I think about the version of myself who sat in that car across the street, listening to hymns through brick walls, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I wish I could reach back and take her hand. I'd tell her this. You survive the things you think will end you. You learn that dignity doesn't ask for permission. You learn that love doesn't disappear just because someone tries to lock it out. And one day you wake up and realize you are still here. Still standing. Still a mother. If you had been in my place, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have searched for the truth? Would you have carried the anger, or learned when to set it down? I'd like to know. There are moments in life that divide us into who we were before and who we become after. Moments that don't ask our permission and don't explain themselves while they're happening. Being banned from my own son's funeral was one of those moments for me. For a long time I thought the deepest pain was losing him, and maybe it was, but being told I didn't belong in his final goodbye cut in a different way, It made me question my place, my worth, my right to grieve. It made me wonder how easily love can be challenged when control takes its place. What I learned is this: no one gets to define your bond with the people you love, not in life, not in death, and certainly not in moments when you're at your most vulnerable. Grief will test you. It will ask you to carry anger, silence, and unanswered questions, but it will also show you how strong you are when you choose truth over comfort, dignity over revenge, and love over bitterness. If you're listening to this and you've ever been shut out, dismissed, or made to feel like your pain didn't count, I want you to hear me clearly. Your grief is real, your love is valid, and your story matters. Would you have done what I did? Would you have searched for answers or tried to keep the peace? Would you have spoken up or stayed silent? If this story touched something in you, share your thoughts. Someone else may need to know they're not alone. And if you want to hear more stories like mine, stories about family, truth, and finding your footing after everything falls apart, stay with me. There's more to tell and more healing to be found together.